Hey everyone, thank you for having me today at the Diana Initiative. I am John Peters. I go by Dark or Darkstar online. If you've seen a little diode, that's me. I'm one of the admins for Try Hack Me, so you've probably seen me on there. Today, I will be giving my talk, Making the Mountain. This is a guide to creating challenging, educational, and enjoyable vulnerable virtual machines. That being said, let's go ahead and dive right in. So first, just a quick overview. I am a pen tester for State Farm here in the United States. Additionally, I am the content director and community manager for Try Hack Me, as well as one of the administrators over there. And then additionally, I am one of the leads for the InfoSec Librarians Guild. Quick heads up, this presentation is actually taken from an article I wrote quite a long time now on the Try Hack Me blog. I've provided a link there, so if you are curious and want to read the original post, go ahead and check it out there. So just a quick intro. Picture this. You've just completed another virtual machine on Try Hack Me, and you're left thinking, well, I kind of want to build one of those for myself. I want to see what goes into this. This seems like a lot of fun. But then you realize you might not have any idea of where to start, and the general idea of making a vulnerable virtual machine can sometimes be overwhelming, just because there's a lot of parts and pieces. Fear no more. In this talk, we're going to go ahead and break that down and simplify it so that anyone can make a vulnerable VM. So a quick overview of why should you want to do this. More than anything, you will learn a lot throughout the process of making a vulnerable VM. There, from the setup and the actual testing, you can learn a lot from even just Defender concepts or general IT concepts of how to stand up a Linux server, how to stand up a Windows server, how do you install services poorly, what are some of the reasons or some of the ways installations can be messed up, things like that. You'll learn a lot from there. Even exploitation, and then as well as failure. Exploitation, you'll learn more of the red teaming or penetration testing concepts when you have to go through and make sure that it works for yourself. But even more so with the actual failure, you'll learn a lot. There are a lot of times where maybe I have released a box or put it into testing, and there was something that I didn't account for. And I learned a lot from that, and it's a great way to pick up a lot of core concepts, especially things you might not be aware of directly. Additionally, this is a great way to make a name for yourself. VulnHub and TryHackMe are both great examples here where a lot of VulnHub creators will have a significant following. There are a lot of creators on TryHackMe like James that has made the Alice in Wonderland series, and a lot of people look forward to his boxes being released, and you can get a bit of a following from that. Additionally, boxes are resume items. Having created a virtual machine and having it released on TryHackMe or VulnHub, that's something that, especially if you're looking to break into or move further into the information security field, that's fantastic to do. And then last but not least, you can also earn some extra cash with this. CTF events will often pay for these boxes to be created for that event because a lot of times they're used just for that one event and maybe released online after the fact. For example, Wild West Hacking Fest, I believe they bring in an external company to create their CTF and things like that. And if you get really good at this, you can start making a lot of money at it. Additionally, at TryHackMe, this is currently something that is on hold as we rework it. We have historically had the Creators Program, where if you make a room, be it educational or a challenge room, and it's really, really well put together, we'll pay you for it because we recognize that, hey, you've made a great asset for the community, and we'd love to have it on TryHackMe, things like that. So keep an eye out for that one to come back. But again, there's a lot of incentive here. Now, let's go ahead and move into the actual meat and potatoes of this talk with reviewing the road ahead. So in this section, we're going to go ahead and break down a lot of the core concepts before we actually start looking at some examples and figuring out how we want to put these together. The first item that we want to consider is, who is your audience for this? And when I say audience, who's going to be doing or going to be hacking the VM that you make? It could be educational. You could be making this for students for a cyber defense club, or maybe you want to teach a concept. For example, maybe teaching how to leverage Kerber roasting or things like that. You can pick something and build around it, and that's a very compelling way to do this. You might be making this as a capture the flag, more of a challenge oriented. You might want to just make something for fun that's just a nice little puzzle. This gets into more of that intermediate to advanced audience, just something to consider as we move forward. And then last but not least, we have the competitive or the King of the Hill scene. This is something that we've had on Try Hack Me for a little while now, but you could make something that maybe you want it to be a multiplayer experience where there are multiple users picking on the same VM, and it might be a much more advanced crowd, but that's another option that you can do. Next up, we have the difficulty. This kind of goes hand in hand with the audience. The first point that we have here is abstraction. How many rabbit holes are there? How much is there required to do in front of each step? Then we have guidance, which is how much of your wiggle room are you going to give your users? Again, this very hand in hand with the audience bit of this. So a good example of this is if you have 2 open ports versus 15, or maybe you have a tar pit and everything's open. You can see how the difficulty increases very quickly with that. Next, you have the actual time frame. So maybe this needs to be done in half an hour. Maybe it needs to be done in an hour. You could have this sitting out and just letting people hack away at it for weeks until they finally get in. So just something to consider. And then last but not least, the actual tools in use. But we'll get a little bit more into that later on in the talk. And then the third core concept that we want to have is telling a story. Again, we'll touch on this a little bit later in the talk, but have this idea in mind, especially as we go into examples next, of this outline, sort of like writing a paper. It's not very far off from that, where you have maybe the 2 key points of your entry point and then your priv-esc, and you can build around that. This additionally gives you and your audience a roadmap. You can have expectations managed in that way, and it's more intuitive to work your way through the VM that you've made after the fact. Let's move into the actual examples. So a couple examples that I like to use as far as demonstrating these concepts, both for educational and then also for more of a challenge-based environment. Quick warning, there are spoilers ahead. If you've done these boxes, that's great. If not, just be aware you might want to tune this out for a moment. I will be covering Blue on Try Hack Me as well as Ignite. That being said, let's go ahead and dive into Blue. Now, this is an educational box, and you're going to see that this is laid out significantly differently than the challenge box that we'll go into next. Let's go ahead and break down the Killchain for this. So the goal for this box is an introduction to exploitation. Just to provide some context on Blue, I had originally created this box as part of a cyber defense club that I was the president for. I wanted just a very basic, run-of-the-mill exploit, something that you could teach people to use Metasploit and other just basic things like Nmap with. So very basic, very core concept driven. That being said, the recon on this is very simple. It's going through, scanning it with Nmap, finding the open ports and services, not really any enumeration beyond that, just seeing what's actually open and then maybe seeing the version of it. Moving on from there, we get into the gaining access stage, which is a point and fire exploit from Metasploit, which is MS-1710, otherwise known as Eternal Blue. Very straightforward, and again, it's done with a beginner audience in mind. Now, this is traditionally where a CTF box would end, wherein you've already rooted the box. Eternal Blue, if you're not aware, gets you an instant administrator access at full ownership of whatever VM you run it against, as long as it succeeds. That being said, within an educational environment, we can do a lot more. Here, we visit the point of escalation just to kind of briefly pay it lip service, specifically with the idea that whoever's doing this box is definitely a little bit newer to hacking, and we just want to put a point of emphasis of, hey, this is where you would have priv-esc if you needed it. Otherwise, this is just it's a moot point in this specific instance. Then we move on to cracking. This is post-exploitation. Since we're already there and we've had control of the box, giving users the experience of using Hashdump as well as Hashcat or John the Ripper is something that, well, we had the opportunity to do it, so we might as well do it. And then we move into flags. In this specific case, again, I mentioned that this was made for a cyber defense competition. These flags, there are 3 of them that are a non-standard location. and I say non-standard as in they're not in the user directory and then not in the administrator directory, but rather in either common loot locations or just areas in Windows, in this case, that you would want to teach a beginner audience about. So, for example, the root of the C drive, the documents folder, the desktop of the administrator, and then I believe the last flag for this is in the SAM folder. There we go. It is where Windows actually stores its settings and where the passwords technically are stored. So again, non-standard locations. The idea there is you want to teach just what these locations are and what their significance is. Let's move into a challenge-based box. So in this case, Ignite. So this is still a boot to root box, and it does require escalation. It's definitely an easier one. However, it still does a great job of demonstrating the full both privask as well as entry point items that we would want to look for with our outline. So the goal with this, very straightforward, boot to root. Moving into enumeration, you have port scanning, and then additionally you need to go through and start investigating these. So you discover that there's a web server, but you need to actually go look at it and find the version that is running. In this case, you'll find that it is Fuel CMS, which we can find the version, I believe, at the bottom of the page in this case. But there's a little bit of additional steps there. Moving on, we have expanded discovery, which is where we move into actually looking up this version, and we can find on ExploitDB that there is a remote code execution bug with this. So something that we can definitely leverage. Moving into the actual exploitation, when we run this exploit, we'll find that it might not work out of the gate. That is because it was written in Python 2, so there's a little bit of troubleshooting that the user has to do to figure out how to actually run it and how to actually use this exploit to gain the initial access. From there, we can go through and actually enumerate the box. Finding the DB config for the actual website will reveal a password, and then we can attempt that with the root user to actually privask and then gain full control here. Let's go ahead and take a step back though. So we've gone ahead and talked about core concepts as well as some examples. Let's see how these boxes line up with those core concepts as well as some design highlights. So first and foremost, I mentioned this outline. We have this idea of a core structure. And on the right, you'll see this handy dandy diagram. This is the Lockheed Martin Killchain, and this is how I like to base my boxes around. We can see that this is the kill chain or the steps that an attacker would take to compromise an organization. However, we can actually mirror this with what we just saw in our examples to go over how a user would compromise a box. So first and foremost, we have the reconnaissance up here at the top. This is really going to be your enumeration and discovery. Weaponization might be finding the actual exploit that you can run against this, and then delivery is actually running it. Exploitation as well as installation, these are traditionally relocated to maybe red team activities, but in this specific case, we can compare it to user enumeration. So maybe finding what privileges the user has, just enumeration on the actual box. And then we can go into maybe command and control becomes privilege escalation, and then beyond that, it's just maintaining access or anything else you want the user to do. But the general idea here is that we have this outline and we can leverage it to sort of have an outline drawn for us for creating our own box, where we have these bullet points over here on the side that we can use to outline exactly what we want the user to do. Moving on to, as I mentioned before, the King of the Hill or more challenge-based instances, or if you want to design something like this, apologies, it looks like part of my slide is covered up there, but the core concept is we would take this outline that we've created and we stack it horizontally, where we have multiple ways in, multiple ways to privask, and multiple issues with the box. So you're essentially creating multiple boxes at the same time and then stacking them all onto the same machine so that there are many issues that can be leveraged, and it makes it very difficult to patch. So the idea with King of the Hill is that you gain access and then you have to quote unquote patch them to prevent other users from getting in. And it makes it very difficult because there's multiple things you need to do. But again, we have our outline and we're stacking it horizontally to create a more engaging experience for more advanced users. Let's highlight the differences real quick between the educational and then the challenge base. The first one is the tool set. So Are we using exploit DB, or are we using just Metasploit? Is this something that is an off-the-shelf exploit, or do we need to actually modify it? As that makes a big difference, especially when you're looking at your difficulty level. As I mentioned earlier, we're managing this based on the audience that we have. Additionally, we have our detail that's provided in the room. So are we narrowing the path? Do we want to be a Sherpa to the users that are actually doing this box, as we would want to do in an educational instance? Or do we want to let them kind of wander and see what they find? And that's something that if you're doing more of a challenge-based box, you can define how wide you want that path to be. The wider you make it, the more difficult it is. And then with the educational box, we saw that we had an expanded scope. So we're already on the box. There's a lot that we can do and a lot more that we can teach in that space without having users repeat steps. So we're already there. Let's teach more. Let's use what we have and take advantage of it. Next, let's move into some higher level design notes, as well as the tooling that we need to actually put these together. So first, some design highlights. As you're making this, make your Killchain first. You want to ideally make your own write-up before you even start on the box. And it's sort of a way that you can give yourself a guide. So that way you have everything planned out and you're not necessarily fumbling around trying to figure out what you need to do next to build this thing. Another consideration is you can actually take snapshots if you're going to make a lot of these. You can take snapshots of installed systems with like VMware or other tools like that, where you have a normal installation up until the point that you're actually going to modify it to make it vulnerable. Having a snapshot at that point right before you make it vulnerable is something that's really useful if you want to make a lot of boxes. And then revisiting that, having your own write-up first, you can sort of connect the dots between each individual bullet points that you create as far as the outline goes and make things very easy for yourself. And then you want to reward your advanced users here. One thing to highlight specifically within the Ignite is that the database config, you could find that if you ran like Dirbuster or GoBuster on the actual website. So if a more advanced user were to visit the website or try to crack through that box, even though it's rated as easy, they would be able to go through and find that and then move through it even faster than someone that might have been a little bit newer. So that idea of rewarding your advanced users, not necessarily something that you need to do as you're building the box, but definitely something to consider. Some additional design highlights. So you want to manage your difficulty level. I touched on this a number of times, but keeping the path narrow, that abstraction point that I mentioned at the beginning is really key here. One of the ways that I like to keep track of this is sort of with a pseudo point system, where everything that I'm adding that can be a distraction is adding a point. And the more points I have, the more theoretically difficult this is. Now, when I say theoretically difficult, boxes can be a little bit hard as you're designing them to know what difficulty range they're truly going to sit in, just because the end user experience might be completely different. Going through and having that pseudo point system can help you have a general idea and give you a little bit more direction in the way that your box is heading. Next, you want to make sure that you research what you're using. So if you're using vulnerable software, find the gotchas before they find you. So if you need to have, let's say, for example, you find something that needs to be installed on a specific version of Linux. That version of Linux might have kernel flaws. So make sure that you research that version. Maybe just check it on Google. It's one search away, or looking on ExploitDB to find that before a user might and bypass all your hard work. And then we have the idea of patching. I'm going to dive into this actually at the end, so I'll go ahead and leave that one for now. And then last but not least in this section, tools of the trade. You will more than likely need a hypervisor for this. Designing these on bare metal is very difficult and not something I would necessarily advise. So a hypervisor is something that you can use to run virtual machines. Common examples of this are ESXi vSphere. That's personally what I use to create my VMs on a server so they're not taking up my desktop and hogging that. You can use VirtualBox, and then you can also use VMware Player / VMware Workstation. The other idea here is as you're designing this, you can actually quote-unquote shop for exploits for what you want to use in your outline. So even before you have your outline together, you can find something that you want to use. And when I say shopping, what do I actually mean by that? So you can go on ExploitDB and click one specific checkbox right over here, the Has App. You can also click Verified if you want, but I recommend just sticking to the Has App. This will list only exploits that have a downloadable installer for the application that is vulnerable. This can be really helpful for building VMs, as we can take these, install them on a box, and then immediately be off to the races. So we can shop around in that way, and then we can build the rest of our kill chain around it. Let's go into actual review and testing. So as you're putting this together, be sure to check every box. These are a couple of the common things that you will need to do at the end of actually, after you've put everything together. First, you want to make sure that you pipe or symlink your history to dev null. That makes sure that users can't just see what you did to set it up. If users can just look at the history, they can usually figure out what's vulnerable very quickly, especially if you haven't cleared it. Remove the fluff. So if there's something that doesn't necessarily need to be installed on the system, you should probably remove it, just because it gives you more that you have to maintain. Anything that you need to keep in mind, especially if it's a CTF box that you want to have it hold up for a while, you need to be patching it. So make sure that everything else is up to date. Update the box as much as you can, because it's going to be less headaches in the future. Avoid password escalation. Ideally, when users are going through, your password should not be the weak point, so make sure that you have a strong password set on the machine. This is something that you ideally want to do right away, as it's easy to forget about it. And keep in mind, when I say strong password, I mean 32 plus characters here, specifically because users will take your password and run it on an AWS cracking rig with 8 graphics cards and see if they can bust through that. If it is the easiest way to get through that box and the fastest way, people will do it. Just be prepared. And additionally, make sure you're not reusing passwords on your VMs that you are using for, actual things like maybe your Twitter account or things like that. Just something to be aware of. And then you can hide Easter eggs. Once you've got all this done, you can go through and hide some things. So maybe you want to go through and add maybe a giveaway code or things like that. You can put them in there, and if you mention it at the beginning, it encourages users to explore, and they get a lot more out of the box in that specific way. One example I really like to use here, is the Advent of Cyber box that I made with Mir, Varg, and Spooky for this last year. It is called Light Cycle for day 24. That box is entirely Tron themed, and there's a lot of little Easter eggs, as well as some subcodes that we put in there originally for Try Hack Me. So you can do a lot with this. You can go through and really flesh out the box creatively with Easter eggs, and it's definitely something that you want to keep in mind. Moving into polishing up, make sure that you have testing done on the box, both by yourself as well as someone that's never seen it. You ideally want someone out of your target audience to actually test it, so keep that in mind. As they find things, if you are dead set on the box being done, make sure that you are documenting any issues that they find. And if it's something that is going to get people stuck, you need to start considering remediation versus annotation. If it's something that is not possible to fix, annotation might be ideal. However, if you can fix it and it improves the box experience, make sure you remediate it. Once you're all done with testing and once it's ready to go, make sure you convert it to an OVA or a QCOW2 file. Those are the two files that are traditionally used by CTF sites, and then you can move into the actual upload and release. So if you wanted to upload this to Try Hack Me, upload it, get the room all set, attach it to the room, and then set it to public, and it'll move into the review queue, and that's actually where I will take over at that point. Some quick extras, something to consider, or things to consider after you've got the box all done, are offline releases and availability. Do you want to host the OVA from a website like a Google Drive so users can download it? Do you want to add worksheets so maybe it's not tied to a specific site? You can create supporting material as well, so maybe it's educational, but the box is very difficult. You can go through and add a bunch of supporting material, like just articles they should read, and it'll lower that difficulty level. And then you also want to make sure users know how to get help. This could be via Discord, so for example, the Try Hack Me Discord, or the Diana Initiative Slack if you are doing the CTF, via email if you want users just to email you if you have this up on VonHub, or if you want to list your Twitter here to have just Twitter DMs be how you handle help. And then in the long run, we also want to take a look at tolerances and maintenance. So CTF, you have this idea of unpredictability, that users are going to do whatever they think is the way to win, and they're going to find the path of least resistance. This requires a lot more maintenance if you want to keep the box current and don't want to have to worry about things like maybe print nightmare. ruining your experience that you've taken so much time to create. So CTF boxes take a lot more time to actually maintain if you want to put in that effort. Educational, not so much. Since it's a guided experience, you don't necessarily have to upkeep the box so long as the tools in question actually work. Users will more or less find their way through it, and they probably won't poke at other things. They might, but those are advanced users, and they're probably already done with your content anyways, so not too much to worry about. And then, again, you have your maintenance considerations from that. So once you have that in mind and what you want to actually do with the box, you can sort of consider what you want to do as far as maintaining it. Some quick pro tips. Use examples. Learn from established boxes. All of my rooms are clonable in this way. So if you're starting to try to put something up on TryHackMe, go and clone my room. One of my rooms. It is in the options up at the top right. Typically, try to understand how and why these are put together. So take a step back, take a look at the outlines that I provided you, as well as the couple examples, and start trying to figure out the actual thought process. Maybe you really like something out on VulnaHub. Go own it. Go find either create a walkthrough or find one, and then extrapolate from that to actually get the highlights. Get feedback as well. Have your friends test it. Get candid feedback as well. If you don't get candid feedback, it's probably not useful feedback. Start at your hardest step when you're actually making this. So if you have a web application that is at the core of the box, but it's really hard to set up, you should probably do that first, just because you don't want to be stuck on that. And then don't be afraid to mess up. Everyone's first box can be a little bit rough, so just make sure that you have it all put together and ready to go as best that you can, and then try to learn from it after the fact. Need any help with this? If you want to learn how to create boxes, feel free to join the TryHackMe Discord. I have a link up in the top left, and then ask to be added to the Creators Lounge chat after you verify. And then you can ask questions. Say, for example, if you're making a box and want some guidance, you can ask them there. Thank you for having me. If you have any questions, I will try to be in the chat at this time. Otherwise, you can reach me on Twitter at darkstar7471, and have a great rest of your conference.